Okay, welcome back. Last time we were talking about the differences between these meta-ethical views, cognitivism and non-cognitivism. Remember, in a nutshell, the big difference between those two views is that the one on the left there, cognitivism, has room for truth and ethics, and the one on the right, non-cognitivism, doesn't. Is there room for truth and ethics? Yes or no? That's going to divide these two views. So if ethics doesn't have room for truth, then what's it all about? So if we shift to the right side of this chart, ethics is much more about emotions and commands than it is beliefs, reason, truth, propositions, and claims. So one of the easiest ways that I keep all of these views separate from one another, the way that I differentiate moral realism, cultural relativism, subjectivism, emotivism, prescriptivism, all these isms, is I look at this chart and I think about the different ways one statement, say, slavery is wrong, would be interpreted. So if you're a moral realist, the expression, or the sentence rather, slavery is wrong, expresses the statement, slavery is wrong, that is grounded in objective features of the world. The moral sentence slavery is wrong, interpreted by a cultural relativist, becomes my culture disapproves of slavery. Interpreted by a cognitive subjectivist becomes I disapprove of slavery. And for an emotivist, it would become an expression of feeling. Not unlike booing and cheering at a sporting event. Notice that expressions of feeling just come up for us. They just show up. They aren't declarative sentences. They're not statements. So even though you utter the word slavery is wrong, the way that an emotivist would interpret that is boo slavery. And for a prescriptivist, it's like the doctor's, giving you a prescription. You must do this. It's an imperative. So slavery is wrong for the prescriptivist is don't enslave. And notice that both of those sentences, boo slavery and don't enslave, they are not truth apt. That's why these are versions of non-cognitivism. It doesn't make sense to say that an exclamation like boo slavery is true or false. It's just like emotions aren't right or wrong, they just are. Same idea. Exclamations like boo slavery or yay so-and-so, they're not true or false. It's just an entirely different kind of sentence. One that does not express a proposition that is true or false. Same thing for imperatives like don't enslave. Think about other exclamations. Ouch! Or darn it! Is ouch true or false? Is darn it true or false? No, it's just, you're just expressing a feeling. Or other commands or imperatives. Take out the trash. Don't touch that. True or false? No, it doesn't quite make sense to describe them that way. So, so there you have emotivism and prescriptivism in a nutshell. So what we'll do now is we'll talk about at least one major problem for both of these views. One thing we can say right off the bat is that they might be too extreme in that if they don't allow any room for truth and ethics, then when you nudge the proponents of these views and you say something like, hey, take the slavery example. Don't you want to say that, don't you believe that slavery is wrong? Don't you think that expresses a true proposition or statement? They would be forced to say no, because that's exactly what they reject. So problem number one, both emotivism and prescriptivism don't allow for any ethical beliefs or any ethical truths, even ones that seem very, very uncontroversial. Like about don't neglect children. So don't you believe that we shouldn't neglect children? Isn't that true that we shouldn't neglect children? The prescriptivists and the emotivists are forced to say, well, I can't say that it's true. I can't say that I believe that, because that doesn't fit into either of those views. The views don't allow for it. So here's another problem for emotivism. So let me skip some of these slides here. You might remember this news story that came out a while ago about Tracy Morgan. Tracy Morgan was doing some stand-up. So he's a actor. He was on SNL. He was on 30 Rock. He's a stand-up comic. And he made some remarks on stage that many thought were homophobic. And so even though it seemed like he was maybe stating his beliefs about homosexuality, if we are emotivists, at least this extreme version of emotivism, what Morgan is really doing is just expressing his feelings about homosexuality. And so we should interpret his words as, boo gayness, or gayness, boo. And so again, the problem there is that we can't even say that Tracy Morgan believed this, or that he was wrong about this, because these views don't admit of belief, truth, or reason. The same issue applies for prescriptivism. So again, instead of boo gayness, we get the imperative, or the command, don't be gay. It's something that you shouldn't do. It's a prescription, just like the doctor gives you a prescription, and along with that is the imperative, take one of these, twice a day after eating. So you can see there the view that moral sentences function like imperatives. And the philosopher that's often credited with the ideas behind prescriptivism is this British philosopher R.M. Hare from the 20th century. By the way, emotivism, going back one slide, is often tied with another British philosopher, A.J. Ayer, A-Y-E-R, A.J. Ayer, which wasn't on the slide there. Same issue arises. So objections, it says there at the bottom. Neither emotivism nor prescriptivism allows for ethical beliefs. And it doesn't allow moral correctness or moral incorrectness. So it seems very sensible to say that Tracy Morgan got it wrong when he was on stage that night, but we wouldn't be allowed to do that if we use this view as our starting point. Okay, so that's it for those 5 meta-ethical views. Again, they were moral realism, cultural relativism, simple or cognitive subjectivism, and then the 2 forms of non-cognitivism, prescriptivism and emotivism. Now what we're going to move on to is looking at the work of a Scottish philosopher named David Hume. And he has 4 important ideas that pertain to our discussion of ethics, and we're going to look at all four of them. Here's the first one that sometimes is called the is-ought problem. The is-ought problem. So to understand what this is all about, let's read some of the words of David Hume. I cannot forbear adding to these reasonings an observation, which may perhaps be found of some importance. So he's been writing this long essay about morality, and he has this kind of side thought. In every system of morality which I have hitherto met with, I have always remarked that the author proceeds for some time in the ordinary way of reasoning, establishes the being of God, makes some observations concerning human affairs, when of a sudden I'm surprised to find that, instead of the usual copulations, propositions is and is not, I meet with no proposition that is not connected with an ought or an ought not. So David Hume is noticing a leap, a jump that he thinks is unfounded. People who've been writing about ethics begin with is statements, which are descriptive, and they jump to ought statements, which are normative. So, for example, if I say that it is sunny outside, that's an is statement. I'm describing something. But if I say you should wear sunblock, you ought to wear sunblock, I'm not merely describing the world. I'm not stating what I believe to be a fact. Instead, I am providing a normative statement. I'm telling you something that you should or ought to do. And logically, this move, David Hume claims, is invalid. He says the change is imperceptible, but is, however, of the last consequence. So if you weren't looking for it, you might not notice, but there's a serious problem here. For as this ought or ought not expresses some new relation or affirmation, 'tis necessary that it should be observed and explained, and at the same time that a reason should be given. For what seems altogether inconceivable, how this new relation can be a deduction from others, which are entirely different from it. So, when every day we reason, we use reason all the time. We might, for example, reason that you look at your phone and it says the 1st, and you say, that must mean that now we are in the month of October, right? So you jump from 1st. You knew what the last month was, which was, say, September. You've been in September a long time. All of a sudden you see the 1st. You're like, it must be that we are in October. And so that would follow, right? That it had been September for a long time. These are your premises. And then you see that it's the 1st. And then you conclude, this is a sort of deductive reasoning, that it's now has to be October. And that sort of reasoning would be valid. It works. There's no problem with it. But so when you go from those ideas to it being October, that reasoning is fine. Or if you went from so-and-so lives in California, therefore they live in the United States, that move would be fine, because we know that California is in the United States. But there are some inferences where the leap is too great, and David Hume thinks that when you go from is statements to ought statements, that this is an inference that is no longer valid. So let's talk through this more to make sure that we're getting it. Just because something is a certain way, it doesn't follow that it ought to be that way. For instance, it might be the case that someone is about to lie, but that doesn't mean that they should. It might be the case that when you get cut off on the freeway when you're driving, your natural reaction is to honk and to drive aggressively, but that doesn't mean that you should. It might be the case that human men, this is probably a stereotype, but human men are hardwired to be unfaithful to their partners and have a strong drive to be with as many partners as they can. Suppose, just for the sake of argument, that there was some biological or evolutionary scientific grounding to that idea about human men. It certainly doesn't follow that that's the way that it should be, right? So that's the argument on this in favor of what Hume is saying. So he's recognizing that this move from the way it is to the way it should be doesn't always work. So now what we're going to do is talk about the counterpoint, the counter idea, or the counter argument. So Hume takes the extreme view that it's never legit to go from an is to an ought. It's never legit to go from descriptive language to normative language. It's never legit to go from facts, like scientific facts, to values, right? It's a fact that humans sometimes lie. Therefore, it's something that's valuable to do. So that doesn't work, right? And so we know at least sometimes it really doesn't seem to work. But Hume takes a stronger view that it never will work. So what I've got next is a hypothetical example that's very, very extreme, but I intend it to be extreme because I really want to push Hume or neo-Humeans who support this is-ought problem with the counterexample. So let's just go to the example. So suppose there is this evil person, and this person's named Oscar. And Oscar is so evil that he is about to torture an innocent child, an innocent baby, by, believe it or not, putting cigarettes out in its eyes. So this is just the way the world is, unfortunately, as we're imagining it. This is just a fact, right? If somebody just walked into this scenario, they could just note that this is what is about to happen. They can kind of see, Oscar holding the cigarette and the baby crying and holding it down. They can see what's about to happen. This is just the way it is. This is just a description, right? This is to say nothing about what should or shouldn't be done. So given our fact here, given our descriptive statement, given our is statement, is it illegitimate to go to 2 here that Oscar should be stopped? So think about it. Given that this is the case, but this evil person is going to torture this child, doesn't it follow that Oscar should be stopped? If you think yes, if you think it's okay to go from this is to this ought, this Oscar is statement to this Oscar ought or should statement, should and ought are synonyms, then that's a problem for David Hume's first big idea, because on most readings of his thinking, it's never legitimate, it's never valid to go from an is to an ought. And so what we have here, it seems, at least in some cases, maybe that's okay. All right, so let's move on to, I said there were 4 big ideas from Hume, so we're going to move on away from the first idea. There's different theories about the source of morality. For some, morality is rooted or aligns with reason and truth and belief. And people who see it that way tend to be cognitivists. We talked about them. Immanuel Kant, arguably, we're going to talk about him, falls into that category. Hume, however, rejects this line of thinking. For him, morality is much more about feeling or emotion or sentiment. It's not about truth. So that little squiggle is called a negation. It means not. It's not about truth. It's more about emotion and desire. It's a rejection of cognitivism. So we'll talk more about that in a second. But first, a little historical snapshot of David Hume. So he's an 18th century Scottish philosopher. Look at his death date. That's interesting. He died in 1776. Of course, that's the year that our country began. His last name on his birth certificate was spelled H-O-M-E, but it was, because he was Scottish, H-O-M-E is pronounced Hume. And he got so annoyed with people mispronouncing his name, some historians say, that he went ahead and changed the O to a U just so people would pronounce it right. Hume. There is a famous school of thought, a famous philosophical school of thought called Empiricism. David Hume is often counted as a famous empiricist. Empiricists, they prioritize or value experience as a vehicle of knowledge over reason. So how do we learn? Do we learn through experience, or do we learn through reason? The empiricists, they say that if you're going to gain knowledge, it's got to be through experience. There's really no other way. David Hume might have been a child genius. So some historians say that he went to university really early, went to the University of Edinburgh, maybe at 10 years old, but at 12 at the latest. So we were reading a section of one of his writings called A Treatise on Human Nature, which he wrote, when he was 26. It's probably not much older than many of you, and it's much younger than I am. He is famously known as an atheist. Some say that if you're ranking the philosophers, David Hume would be number one among the English-speaking ones. And if you ever were a fan of that Lost show, there was a character named Desmond David Hume. Okay, so let's go to big idea number 2. Again, big idea number 1 is that it is invalid. It's an invalid inference to go from is statements to ought statements. Here's big idea numbers 2 and 3. Big idea number 2 is a rejection of realism. For Hume, morality is not about the external world, as it were. Instead, it's more about our internal worlds. Morality is grounded on our feelings, and our feelings are part of our mental states, our mind, our consciousness. And so morality is mind dependent. And if that's the case, then moral facts that are hinge upon objective features of the world don't make any sense. So he rejects realism. Big idea number 3 is that morality is grounded in emotion, not belief or reason. So that's a rejection of cognitivism. So he rejects realism, he's an anti-realist, and he rejects cognitivism, so he's a non-cognitivist. So how does he back this up? Well, in his treatise, he says, take any action allowed to be vicious, willful murder, for instance, examine it in all lights, and see if you can find the matter of fact or real existence, which you can call vice. In whichever way you take it, you find only certain passions, motives, volitions, and thoughts. There is no other matter of fact in the case. The vice entirely escapes you as long as you consider the object. You never can find it till you turn your reflection into your own breast and find a sentiment of disapprobation. So what's going on in this example? Well, take a moment and imagine that you're witnessing a murder. Maybe someone is stabbing someone to death. Try to point out the wrongness. Where would it be? Would it be in the intention of the mind of the murderer? Would it be in the knife in his hand or her hand? Would it be in the volumes of the blood spilt? For Hume, he says you're not going to find it. The wrongness is something that is rooted in our experience of, say, willful murder, and rooted in specifically our emotional reaction to that. And what we do is we project our emotional experience onto the world. So you got to reflect inward. You can't be looking external. You got to go internal. You reflect internal into your heart, into your own breast, and you'll find emotion. So the word there is sentiment. Sentiment is a fancy way of talking about emotions, and a negative sentiment or a sentiment of disapproval. That's similar to it's not appropriate, disapprobation. He continues. This sentiment, this feeling which arises in you toward this action, it's a matter of fact, but it's an object of feeling, not of reason, right? So there he's explicitly saying morality is about feelings, not reason. So he's rejecting cognitivism, isn't he? So he'd be more on the side of maybe the emotivist or the prescriptivist, or maybe he's really just laying down the groundwork for those sorts of ideas. Remember, Eyre and Hare, they wrote in the 20th century, and Hume maybe laid the foundation hundreds of years before that. It lies in yourself, not the object. So it's not external, it's not mind independent, it's not objective, it is mind dependent. That's the big idea number 2. It's a rejection of realism. Realism and objectivism are synonyms. You can use them interchangeably. When you pronounce any action or character to be vicious, you mean nothing but that from the constitution of your nature. So you're really talking about yourself in your own personal lens and less about the objective world. You have a feeling or sentiment of blame from the contemplation of it. Just by thinking about it, these emotions will crop up in us. Vice and virtue, therefore, may be compared to sounds, colors, heat, and cold, which, according to modern philosophy, are not qualities and objects, but perceptions in the mind. So Hume is drawing an analogy between morality and colors and the experience of heat and coolness. So think about colors for a moment. Look around the room wherever you are and look at the color of something, and you might point at it and say, oh, that is blue, that is red, that is yellow. And it's like you're pointing to something external, and you're saying that external thing has the objective property of being yellow. Well, if you talk to people that study color or they study vision, they will tell you that that's not quite right. The color yellow is in your experience of yellow. So yellow is really in your head. The experience of yellow is a representation of what's really objectively out there. So color experiences are in our minds. What's really on, say, a wall that's painted yellow is not experience. The wall doesn't have the experience. Experience is in your mind, which is, not even touching. Your meters or feet away from the wall. So what's really on the wall? Well, the wall has a molecular surface. It has a chemistry. And if you know some physics or chemistry, or you know about the electromagnetic spectrum, that there are waves of light, wavelengths of light that are refracting off of the wall, and then your eye, the retina in your eye, is picking up on those wavelengths, and it goes into your optical nerve and into the lobes of your mind, into your brain, and there's because of your neurology, and then it lights up, and there's a color experience. So what's objectively out there, wavelengths and a molecular surface. But color is really subjective. But when we say that's yellow, we're projecting our color experience onto, say, the wall. Same thing with morality. In the world, there is, so if we looked at, so I didn't want to have a picture of a real murder here, so I've got a knife and ketchup and a hot dog. So there's no wrongness external to us. There's no wrongness objectively in the blood or in the knife or in the severed limb. However, it is, in our hearts and our feelings and our minds, and we project that onto the world. So the rules of morality, therefore, are not conclusions of reason. So that confirms big idea number 3. So Hume is often described as a sort of projectivism, because we project our experience onto the world, even though it's not really technically there. Okay, so that's big ideas 1, 2, and 3. Again, 1, the is-ought problem. You can't logically derive ought statements from is. Number 2, there's no truth in ethics, so that is a rejection of realism. Morality is mind dependent. And then number 3 is that morality is grounded in emotion. Okay, so let's go to big idea number 4. Reason alone cannot motivate. So before I start reading the lines from his treatise, imagine that you're on campus, you're sitting in a classroom, and you know that in the hall outside the classroom there is a drinking fountain, there's a water fountain. You know that if you stand up and walk to the water fountain and it's functioning, and you bend down and you open your mouth and you suck in, that this will be hydrating for you. So these are just the facts, and you're reasoning this out. The fact that there's a water fountain out there, and then if you walk out there and you drink from this fountain, then thirst will be quenched, you'll be hydrated. But this alone will not get you out of your chair. It's not enough. What's missing is desire. You need to have a desire to quench your thirst. You need to be thirsty. So belief and reason alone, they're not going to get you to do a damn thing, says Hume. There has to be a desire there. So let's see what he says. Reason alone can never have such influence. Morals excite passions and produce or prevent actions. Reason of itself is utterly impotent. Strong language in this particular. Reason is and ought to be the slave of the passions. He's almost getting poetic here. So your beliefs about the world and the way you reason through those beliefs, it's not going to get you anywhere unless you have a passion, unless you have a motive, unless you have a drive or desire. That's what's really running the show. So your beliefs are really slave to the whims of your desires. It can't pretend to have any other office than to serve and obey them. 'Tis not contrary to reason to prefer the destruction of the whole world to the scratching of my finger. This is one of my favorite quotes from Hume. What he's saying here is desires are not, they're really outside the sphere of reason and truth and rationality. They just show up. Just like our emotions, they just show up. They're not right or wrong. Desires are not right or wrong. So even if you had a desire for something that is quote unquote nuts, it really isn't right or wrong. Suppose that there was a malfunction in some of those nuclear silos, that we have in some hidden base, deep under the ground, and they were going to shoot off a bunch of nuclear warheads, toward, I don't know, North Korea or Russia or China, or whatever, or maybe all of them were going to go off. And, once they strike their targets, that the North Koreans or Russians or the Chinese or whomever, Iran, whatever you want, they're going to strike back. So it'll be this horrible nuclear holocaust. And let's say that you can prevent all of this just by hitting the abort button. Like that big red button that you see in movies, and it's kind of encased in that glass encasement, for lack of a better word, and you got to lift it up and then, maybe turn the key and then push the button. And so you lift it up and you see, but the plastic on the button has kind of been old, never been used, and that if you push the button, you're going to cut your finger. Nay, you're not even going to cut your finger. You're just going to scratch your finger. And you're about to push it, and you're like, I don't really want to scratch my finger. I'll just let this nuclear holocaust unfold. So that desire for, you'd rather the world basically all be blown up just so that you don't scratch your finger, that you would say that's a crazy desire. That is just wrong. Well, but Hume will hold his ground firm and say, no, not even a desire like that is crazy or nuts or wrong. Okay, so those are Hume's 4 big ideas. And we'll pause there. And once again, thank you very much for listening.